There was a man who lived where the wind had no obstacles, where the land didn't curve to protect or shelter, where the sky felt heavier only because nothing else reached high enough to meet it. He had once been called many things: cowhand, scout, loner, maybe even outlaw, but now no one called him anything at all. There was no one around to speak. The cabin wasn't much. It leaned a little to the west, like it was tired of holding itself up. Its walls were made of wood that remembered better days and a roof patched with whatever could keep the water out: horse blankets, old feed sacks, even an oilskin coat once worn into town. Inside, the floor was swept but cracked, the table only just stood upright, and the bed was a collection of soft things layered until they felt something like sleep. He didn't keep clocks. The days came and went with the light and the ache in his knees. He woke with the first blue of dawn and warmed water over the stove that never cooled entirely. Coffee was made in the same dented tin pot every morning. The chair he sat in had grooves in it now, the shape of his hips carved into the wood like a fingerprint. He rarely made noise, not because he feared it, but because there was nothing that required it. His voice, if it still existed, lived somewhere deep in his ribs, under layers of dust and time, except when the wind came. And the wind always came. Some mornings, it came as a whisper, curling through the cracks in the walls, stroking his boots, slipping into the seams of his coat like an old friend testing the strength of a forgotten bond. Other days, it arrived like a threat, slamming against the cabin door, rattling the windows, lifting the edge of the roof just enough to remind him that nothing here lasted forever. He talked to it. Not in words, exactly, but in muttered breaths. In the way he moved, in the way he looked out across the endless brown grass and nodded. Sometimes he asked it questions. Think they still remember my name? Winds out of the east today. Smells like snow. Once, years ago, he'd tried to write things down in a little book with a red leather cover. But the wind had taken that too, torn it clean from the sill one stormy afternoon, and carried it off into the distance. He hadn't gone looking. Some things are better off scattered. There were days when even the animals didn't come near. No birds, no snakes, no cattle calls from distant ranches. Just the wind and him, and the way the silence settled like dust over everything. On those days, he remembered too much. The weight of a saddle. The way her hair smelled before the fire took the house. The long walk home after no one came back. From the canyon, but the wind never asked him to forget. It just kept showing up, day after day, speaking in rustle and whistle and howl. It was his only constant. It didn't need food or shelter or kindness, just space. And that he had plenty of. He built a wind chime out of spoons once, hung it on the post outside the door. It clattered like bones in a sack when the gusts got strong, and he liked that. It made the wind seem less invisible. Sometimes he'd take a chair outside and just sit, eyes narrowed under the brim of a sun-stained hat, coat buttoned to the chin. He'd sit for hours watching the horizon, as if expecting someone, but no one ever came. And when the light began to shift orange, he'd whisper, "That's all right," and the wind would answer with a long, low sigh. He wasn't lonely, not exactly. He just didn't expect company. Until that one afternoon when the air changed. The sky, which had been a clear and careless blue all morning, darkened without warning, not to gray, but to a kind of bruised green, the kind of color you feel in your stomach before you see it with your eyes. The wind paused, just briefly, like it had forgotten its line in a script. He stood on the porch and sniffed the air. Rain, not a drizzle, a downpour. He could feel it coming, thick and close. He went inside, threw another log on the fire, and placed a pot under the drip near the window. The cabin held its breath. And then the wind returned, but this time it brought something else. Footsteps, not one, not two, many. and a knock that never came because the door didn't wait to be invited. It opened slow, and what stood there wasn't the storm. It was 6 women, soaked to the bone, eyes hollowed by more than just cold. But that's for another chapter. Let me know where you listening from tonight. And what time is it where you are? I love seeing this quiet circle grow around the world. If this kind of slow, silent story means something to you, consider subscribing and tapping like it helps me keep telling them. The rain didn't start with a warning. It came all at once, as if the sky had been holding its breath too long and finally exhaled all at once, fast, hard, and with no patience left for politeness. And the cowboy, who had grown used to the gentle shifts of weather on the plains, paused. In the act of setting his coffee down, his hand hovering above the table as the first drops struck the roof with a sound that didn't quite belong. It wasn't the familiar tap of a lazy drizzle or the hollow drumming of an angry storm. It was scattered, uneven, and too close, as though the rain wasn't falling from above, but arriving from the side, confused about direction. He sat perfectly still, eyes narrowing under the brim of his hat, listening to the strange cadence that echoed overhead, not frantic, not urgent, just unfamiliar, like a rhythm that knew it wasn't supposed to be heard and had shown up anyway. Outside, the world had turned to shadow, the kind of darkness that folds into the horizon and makes even nearby things look far away. And the wind no longer spoke in whistles, but in long, wordless groans that wrapped around the cabin like ropes, pulling taut. The cowboy didn't move to check the windows. There was nothing to see but gray, but he did tilt his head slightly, the way an animal does when it hears a sound it doesn't recognize but instinctively knows matters. The roof patched and layered with anything that might keep out water, had always sung in the rain's soft lullabies made of tin and tension, but this was different. Something up there had weight, not much, but just enough to change the pitch, to shift the song from solitude into suspicion. He leaned back in his chair, letting the fire pop and spit beside him, the warmth licking at his boots while his ears strained toward the ceiling. There it was again, that brief scrape, not metal, not branch, not bird. Something softer, heavier, placed rather than dropped, followed by a silence that didn't sit right, the kind of silence that expects a reaction. The cowboy had spent years listening to weather like most people listened to conversation. And he knew when the air was holding something it didn't want to say. He knew when the roof was sheltering more than wood and memory. Slowly, he stood, letting his knees crack and his spine stretch from the hours of stillness, and crossed the room without hurry, picking up the kettle not because he needed more coffee, because rituals made uncertainty feel smaller. He poured water and waited, the steam rising in hesitant coils, and still, that strange weight lingered on the roof, like the rain had dropped something it hadn't meant to carry. He considered going outside, stepping into the storm to see what. The wind had dragged to his doorstep, but something held him back, not fear, not laziness, but a kind of reverence, like a man watching the final seconds of a prayer. The cowboy knew, in the way men like him always did, that whatever had arrived was not a mistake. That silence doesn't change its shape unless it's asked to make room for something new. He sat again, mug in hand, and listened not to the rain, but to the way the roof answered it, not in leaks or creaks, but in a tone just off from what it had been before. There was something living in the sound now, something human, or close enough to it that his bones recognized the shift, even if his mind refused to name it. The fire cracked again, louder this time, and the cowboy didn't flinch. Outside, the wind whispered something he didn't quite catch, and overhead, the roof kept singing that strange new song, as if announcing that the storm had brought more than water, and that the quiet he'd lived in so long had begun to unravel, thread by thread, in the shape of footsteps that had not yet reached the door. The door didn't knock, didn't groan, didn't creak with warning, it simply opened. As if it had known before the man did that it was time for the threshold to forget its stillness. He didn't rise from his chair when it happened. Didn't reach for the rifle hanging above the stove or even turn his head immediately. Because in places like this, doors don't open unless they have something worth carrying in. And somehow, he already knew it wasn't wind this time. Instead, he watched in the reflection of the blackened window pane as 6 figures stepped through the frame, wet silhouettes cut from storm cloud and silence. Their coats dripping, their hats or scarves clutched in hands that didn't tremble, but didn't rest either, and their eyes, each of them, scanning the room not with hunger or fear, but with the careful attention of people who had stopped expecting answers and now only sought air that didn't threaten them. They did not speak, not to each other, not to him, not even with their mouths half-parted in apology or request, because there was nothing to ask and nothing to give, not in words. They stepped into the warmth without claiming it, arranged themselves along the cabin walls like old photographs left too long in the sun. Faded but still present, and though the room was small, it made space for them in the way places sometimes do when they understand they are no longer just shelter but reprieve. Their boots were caked in mud that cracked as it dried, and their shoulders held the slope of people who had walked far enough to forget where they started, yet none of them looked down. They looked at the cowboy not directly, but in his direction, in the way someone looks at a fire they don't own but might one day have to feed. He met their eyes, one by one, not for long, not in challenge, but as if to say, I see you, I hear what you're not saying, and I won't ask you to say it. One of them, a woman with rain dripping from the ends of her hair like clock hands, removed her coat and hung it on the nearest nail without invitation. And the rest followed without glance or nod, as if movement itself was enough of a conversation. The cowboy took a slow sip of coffee, now lukewarm and bitter, and placed the cup down as the sound of water hitting the roof softened behind them, muted by the mass of bodies now between him and the storm. Still, no one spoke, but in that silence was a tension not of discomfort, but of unfamiliar peace, like a held breath finally being allowed to pause before continuing. The room, which had echoed only with fire crackles and wind sighs for years, now held a new kind of quiet one shaped by shared breath, soaked fabric, and the gentle rustle of people trying not to disturb what they had found. He watched as one of them crouched near the stove, not asking for permission, but sensing the space, and extended her hands toward the heat, her fingers trembling in the way things do when they begin to thaw. No introductions came, no explanations, no glances to the window to see if others were coming. Because these 6 women were not messengers or wanderers or guests, they were the storm's offering, and the cabin had accepted. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, just slightly, letting the wood creak beneath him like a low greeting. And the wind outside died down enough for him to hear the sound of their clothes drying, the water dripping from hems and sleeves into small puddles on the floor. It was the first time in years the cabin had welcomed more than one heartbeat. And it held them all now, quietly, as if afraid to speak and ruin what had stepped in with the rain. The shelter, once filled only with the sound of wind slipping through the cracks and the slow rhythm of one man's breath, now pulsed with the faint echo of 6 others, all strangers, all silent, yet present in a way that changed the very air. Inside the walls, the fire once tended with no urgency and no need to impress, burned now with a steadiness that seemed to understand it was no longer warming a man, but a gathering, a congregation without doctrine or demand. They didn't sit in a circle or form lines, they scattered in the instinctive way people do when they know space is something to be respected, not possessed. One took to the floor near the window, wrapping her arms around her knees like they were the last thing she trusted. Another leaned against the back wall with her eyes half closed, neither resting nor fully awake, while 2 more shared the end. of a blanket with the kind of wordless coordination that only exists among people who've run out of words long ago. The cowboy did not host them. He merely allowed the room to be what it needed to be. And in return, the women did not ask for more than warmth and distance. The silence between them was not cold or awkward. It had weight, like an extra log thrown on the fire, like the smell of steam rising from damp clothes, like breath that doesn't want to be noticed but cannot help leaving a mark on the window pane. No one reached for the kettle without first glancing around. No one took more bread than necessary. No one shifted too quickly or spoke too loud, because somehow they all understood that the quiet here wasn't emptiness, it was agreement. Fragile pact made without words that this moment, however brief, belonged to no one and therefore to everyone. The cowboy offered no greetings, no introductions. Only a gesture toward the pot and an extra tin cup placed on the table with slow hands, and that was enough, more than enough, for someone to approach and pour, and nod and step back without breaking anything. Outside, the storm had softened, but the rain continued, steady as breath, steady as the hush inside the cabin, and the wind now circled the walls, not as a threat, but as an old story retold by someone who had learned to speak softer. The room held no names, no histories, no explanations, but it held bodies and shared space and heat, and the simple act of existing side by side without demanding to be known. And in that closeness, something else passed between them, a kind of invisible permission to remain human, even in ruin. The cowboy, sitting in his usual chair, didn't look directly at any one of them, but he saw them all in the way his fingers paused around the handle of his cup, in the way his boots tapped once against the floor and then stopped, in the way he let the fire burn longer than usual before adding more wood. The women, for their part, spoke with their stillness. Each minute that passed without movement was a sentence of trust. Each glance toward the stove a punctuation mark in a language made entirely of restraint. And so the cabin became something new, not just walls and roof and fire, but a vessel for breath that no longer belonged to one man, and a silence that, having once wrapped itself around solitude, now bent to hold the weight of 6 others, evenly and without asking anything in return. It was late, though no one had mentioned the time, not with words, and not with glances, but the kind of late that settles into your bones before you even realize how dark the corners of the room have become. The fire had dimmed, its once bold flames now whispering against the iron walls of the stove, and the women had all found their still places in the cabin like dust settling into forgotten seams, except one. She sat closest to the heat, not by choice, but by gravity, as if sorrow had pulled her toward warmth, and then anchored her there. And though her posture was careful, composed, something in the slope of her shoulders told the truth long before her breath betrayed it. It began quietly, so quietly that at first the cowboy thought it was just the creak of the roof shifting under wind, but then came the soft catch in her throat, the shimmer at the edge of her lashes, the kind of sound that doesn't ask for comfort but cannot contain itself either. And he knew, without question, that she was crying. No gasping, no heaving, no collapse, just tears, silent as snow, carving paths down a face already shaped by other weather. And the others didn't turn or react, not out of coldness, but out of respect, as if they understood that this moment was not theirs to witness, but simply to allow. The cowboy rose without haste. Without the scrape of a chair or the heavy thud of boots, he moved like the cabin had always meant for him to do exactly that at exactly this time. And he reached for the kettle, still warm from earlier, still fragrant with the kind of tea that doesn't promise much but delivers more than it should. He poured slowly, the steam rising between them like a veil, and walked the cup over without meeting her eyes. Because some gifts aren't about eye contact, they're about offering without demand. He crouched beside her, just long enough to place the tin mug within reach, and then retreated again, folding himself back into his seat like the exchange had been rehearsed in another life. She didn't say thank you, didn't nod, didn't even move right away. But her fingers found the cup a minute later, curling around it like she was afraid it might vanish if she blinked too long, and she brought it to her lips with the kind of reverence reserved for things too rare to be taken for granted. Her crying did not stop, but it changed, softened, like the first few drops of rain on dry earth, a grief no longer hidden, but accepted, not healed, but seen. And in that moment the room grew warmer, not in temperature, but in tone, as if the air itself had leaned in closer, paying attention to something that hadn't been spoken, but had been heard all the same. No one said anything, and no one needed to, because in that cabin, language had become an unnecessary luxury, replaced by glances and gestures, by tea poured in silence, by boots left dripping by the door and blankets adjusted without being asked. And as the wind outside turned gentler, slipping beneath the eaves like a dog returning to its place by the fire, the cowboy took another sip of his own cup and let the moment remain whole and undisturbed, a quiet offering between strangers who had come not for answers, but for the kind of stillness that holds you even when everything inside is trying to fall apart. The sky never cleared, not once, not for a sliver of sun or the brief outline of a cloud worth naming. Instead, the days folded into one another like damp cloth, heavy and without shape, and the light that slipped through the cabin's windows. Each morning was pale, tired, as though it too had been walking in mud for days. Outside, the ground had turned to a thick, clinging mud that swallowed footsteps whole. Mud that remembered where you'd been and refused to let you forget it. And inside, the silence deepened into something less like absence and more like agreement. The cowboy no longer kept track of how long it had been since they arrived. Because time didn't pass in hours here, it passed in how many times the fire had to be stoked, how often the kettle was refilled, how long a coat took to dry by the door. The 6 women remained, not as guests and not as burdens, but as constants, like the wind or the ache in the cowboy's shoulder when the weather turned to still. Each had found her space, claimed it not with authority, but with repetition. The same spot on the floor, the same reach for the ladle, the same careful folding of a blanket that wasn't hers, but now belonged to her anyway. And though they were always separate, each woman a small island of breath and weight and quiet, they existed near each other with the kind of closeness that didn't require speech, only presence. The cabin, small as it was, never felt crowded. Perhaps because no one tried to own more than they needed. No one spread out or demanded warmth beyond what the fire offered. And even the silences overlapped without friction, like shadows at sunset. Sometimes they would move at the same time, 2 hands reaching for a tin cup, 2 bodies shifting on the floor, and then pause, acknowledge each other not with words or smiles, but with stillness, letting the moment pass unclaimed, like a gift left unopened on purpose. The cowboy watched all this without intrusion, noting how they adapted to the space the same way he had years ago, by learning what not to ask for, what to carry in silence, what to leave untouched. He no longer expected them to leave, just as he hadn't expected them to come, and in that acceptance, something inside him softened, though he wouldn't have known how to name it even if someone had asked. Outside, the wind occasionally threw a tantrum, slapping the windows with rain or bending the bare trees into brittle arcs. But inside, the storm had nowhere left to reach. Everything here had already bent or broken, and then learned how to sit quietly with the pieces. Food was shared without comment, chores done without suggestion. And when someone stirred in their sleep or shifted in pain, another would adjust a blanket or slide a pot closer to the heat, all without looking up, all without acknowledgement. The cowboy had once believed silence meant distance, but now he understood it could also mean permission to stay, to rest, to be left alone, but not forgotten. The women rarely looked at him, but when they did, it was with a gaze that didn't ask who he had been or why he lived alone, only whether the stove needed more wood, whether the water was boiling yet, whether the wind had said anything new. And in those exchanges, brief and wordless, something began to knit itself into the bones of the place, a rhythm, a trust, a mutual understanding that what they had found here wasn't safety, exactly, but the next closest thing, a space where the days could melt together, soft and formless, and no one would be asked to explain why they stayed. He had never meant to learn them, not in the way one learns names or faces or facts, but in the slower, quieter way a man learns the shape of a creek by walking beside it every day. The cowboy found himself memorizing them one by one. Not through study, but through exposure, through the repetition of shared silence and unchanging proximity. The woman who always stirred her tea 3 times, never more, never less, before taking the first sip. The one who folded her coat each night and placed it on the same corner of the table, as if believing that order could protect something she could no longer name. The woman who never looked anyone in the eye but always positioned herself nearest the fire, as if the heat might speak in the place of words. Another who sat by the window each morning, back straight, hands resting in her lap like she was waiting for someone who hadn't been promised but might still come anyway. There was the woman who touched every cup before choosing one, her fingers brushing metal like they were remembering what it meant to choose anything at all. And the last quietest of them all, who slept with her boots still laced and her satchel still buckled, as if any moment might demand a departure. And the cowboy, who had once believed he'd forgotten how to pay attention to anything other than weather and wind, now found his gaze drawn to these small repetitions with a tenderness he didn't know he had left. He didn't interfere, didn't ask, didn't speak. He simply noticed, and in noticing, something in him softened further, like a knot loosened without being untied. The women, in turn, had begun to read him too, not in grand gestures or spoken moments, but in the way his hand hovered over the kettle before pouring, in the slight shift of his boot when the wind changed direction, in the way he added wood to the stove before anyone asked, as if he had felt the drop in the room's breath before it reached their skin. They understood now that his silence wasn't resistance, it was language. And like all languages, it had its grammar, the pause before emotion, the way he left the door cracked on warmer nights, the way he stood a little longer outside before coming in, eyes to the sky like he was listening for something older than weather. They began responding in kind, not with words, but with small changes, shared glances, a cup filled and left beside him before he asked, a coat hung beside his without hesitation, a blanket folded and placed where he always sat when the fire grew. Lo, these gestures were not dramatic, not declarative. They were subtle recognitions, acknowledgments of space shared not because it was offered, but because it was trusted. And in that trust, the cabin grew even quieter, not with emptiness, but with a fullness that didn't need announcing. There were still no stories told, no pasts exchanged, but the cowboy knew that each woman carried one, sometimes in the way her fingers curled around a spoon, sometimes in the way she pressed her back to the wall as if bracing against something that hadn't happened yet, sometimes in the sudden stillness that came over her when laughter threatened to rise and was swallowed before it reached the air. And though he would never ask, never want to know the details, he carried them with him now in how he watched the door, in how he poured the last of the coffee before it was gone, in how he found himself waiting for their sounds in the morning, the way he once waited only for wind. They had become, in some small and unspoken way, his companions, not in the way of friends or family, but in the way shadows become familiar when they follow you long enough without asking why you never turn. On the light, the rain softened that evening, not quite stopping, but pulling back in a way that suggested it was tired of itself, as if even the clouds had grown heavy from too many days of weeping. It wasn't silence, not yet, but the kind of hush that comes before a door is opened or a name is spoken, the kind that wraps around you like a coat left out in the cold, still warm, but not for long. Inside the cabin, the women moved slower, quieter, though they had never been loud to begin with. And yet something was different, not in the volume of their breath or the number of steps taken, but in the weight of them, like each gesture now had an aftertaste. The cowboy noticed it first in the way one of them folded her blanket twice instead of once, smoothing the corners like she was preparing something to be remembered, not used. Another stared longer into her cup before drinking, holding it as if she expected it to tell her something before she let it go. One cleaned her boots, not for wear, but for the road, the kind of cleaning you do when your next step matters more than the last one. They didn't look at each other, not directly, but their eyes passed in shared motion glances that said what mouths never would. That tonight was the last night, even if no one had agreed to say it aloud. The stove burned lower than usual, not from neglect, but as if everyone had silently chosen not to disturb the balance of that quiet hour, not to break the fragile thread that held them all in the same moment. The cowboy didn't ask, didn't move to stop it. He just sat in his usual place, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup, listening to the kind of silence that was full, not empty, the kind that carried more weight than thunder ever could. He remembered a time, years ago, when a friend had left without warning, and all that had been left behind was the way the air changed in a room once they were done. He felt that shift now. Before it happened, like the room was already remembering them while they were still there. The women packed nothing, yet things disappeared. A scarf that had hung by the door, a small comb left near the window, the extra spoon no one had used, but everyone had noticed gone, like they had already begun to leave piece by piece, memory by memory. One woman stood by the window longer than usual, not watching the rain, but her own reflection in the glass, as if trying to see the version of herself that had entered this place days ago, and compare it to the one now thinking of stepping out again. No one cried, no one laughed, no one told a story, because nothing ruins the sacredness of a shared stillness faster than trying to make it last by naming it. The cowboy glanced at the door, not because he expected them to walk through it, just yet, but because he wanted to remember how it looked before they were gone, how the light hit its frame when it was still holding them inside. The fire dimmed, and no one rose to feed it, not because they had forgotten, but because they had chosen to let it end slowly, in its own way, like everything else in that room. And when the wind shifted, just barely, sliding along the roof with a sound like a sigh, they all heard it, not as a warning, not as an invitation, but as confirmation of something already decided. And though no goodbyes were spoken, the cowboy knew that the next dawn would look different, feel different, sound different, not in the obvious ways, but in the absence of tiny things. Footsteps on old wood, the rhythm of shared breathing, the invisible tether of strangers who never meant to stay but had, if only for a little while, made his silence feel like company. They woke before the sun, before the wind had stretched its arms across the plains, before the fire had completely died in its sleep, woke not with suddenness, but with the quiet deliberation of people who had decided something in the night and had no more need for dreams. They moved through the cabin like shadows, remembering their shapes, gathering what little they had not yet given to stillness. Scarves that had held warmth, shoes that still smelled of damp wood, satchels as light as breath. No one spoke, not from fear or anger or reluctance, but because the moment did not ask for speech, only for attention, only for grace. The cowboy stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, not as a guard, but as a witness. And though his face did not change, something in the set of his shoulders held the knowledge that this threshold would mean something different by evening. The women passed him one by one, not with nods or words, but with presence, each glance a soft thank you, each step a soft farewell, each pause a silent confirmation that what had happened here would not be forgotten. The ground outside was thick, with the memory of rain, and their boots sank slightly with every step, leaving behind imperfect trails, small hollows that filled with the water of a world trying to smooth itself over too quickly. None of them looked back, not once, not because they didn't care, but because some things are too fragile to survive a second gaze. And this strange communion of silence, of shared weather and warmth, was one of them. The cowboy didn't call out, didn't ask questions, didn't offer warnings or wishes, because he knew the language they had all spoken required no punctuation, only respect, and distance and space to let the silence keep what it had gathered. He watched them walk away until the landscape reclaimed them, until their outlines blurred into the low-hanging fog that still clung to the hills like a sigh not quite released. Behind them, the cabin felt larger, but not emptier, just quieter, as if holding its breath in their absence. Unsure whether to return to the life it had known before or wait for the echo of their presence to fade first, the muddy footprints by the door began to dry, curling slightly at the edges like parchment left in the sun. And though the cowboy could have swept them away, he didn't, not yet, maybe not ever, because they were the only proof he had that the silence had once been shared, that the wind had once been answered by more than one voice. And inside, everything remained as they had left it. The cup still half full on the table, the blanket slightly askew on the bench, the faint scent of soap and rain and other lives folded into the air like smoke into wood. He turned back into the cabin slowly, not as a man returning to solitude, but as someone adjusting to the space where a memory had just passed through a space that still hummed with the weight of unsaid things and unasked questions, that now knew what it meant to hold more than one heart at a time. And though no footsteps echoed behind him, the cowboy felt them anyway, ghost-like but real, soft but solid, the kind that follow you not with sound but with silence and linger, even after the rain has stopped. The cabin was still, the kind of stillness that follows a farewell, not the absence of sound, but the residue of presence, chairs slightly pulled back as if someone had just stood up. A cup turned a few degrees from its usual resting place. A single hair caught in the fabric of a blanket. The cowboy sat where he always had, boots resting on worn wooden planks that had memorized the weight of him. But now they also remembered others' lighter steps, hesitant at first, then certain, then gone. The fire had burned low the night before, and he had let it, watching the last embers fade, not as something ending, but as something folding itself gently away. Now the room felt familiar again, but not in the old way, not in the way of endless sameness, but in the way of return, of something touched and altered and left to breathe again on its own. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like it always had, whispering across the open land in long, curling sighs. But the cowboy heard it differently now, not louder, not faster, just fuller, as if it carried more voices, more echoes, more stories caught in its folds. He stepped outside without his coat, letting the chill press against his skin, the way the memory of a hand does after it's gone, not unwelcome, not painful, just there. The sky above him was wide and gray, the kind of sky that doesn't promise rain but doesn't rule it out either, and he tilted his head slightly as if to hear something just at the edge of it, a murmur, a wordless return. For years he had spoken only to the wind, not with words, but with gestures, with the quiet offerings of a man who had no one to speak back. But now, when he listened, he swore he could hear 6 different silences layered into its howl. The woman who stirred her tea in threes, the one who folded her coat just so, the boots that never left her feet, the hands that touched every cup, the eyes that met none, and still saw everything. The presence that had slept closest to the fire but furthest from touch. They were gone, but their quiet lingered, tucked into the corners of the cabin, slipped between the pages of the book he never read but always carried, resting in the tilt of his hat, the way he now waited half a second longer before closing the door, because he had learned that silence could stretch across time and space and remain warm, could be carried without burden, could become a companion without demand. He didn't mourn their leaving, not because he hadn't cared, but because what they had left behind was not absence, but imprint. And an imprint is a kind of presence that needs no tending, only remembering. He poured himself coffee, black and quiet, and drank it slowly, letting the heat sit in his chest like a name never spoken out loud but always known. Outside, the wind picked up, skimming across the plains with a voice that didn't ask questions but answered them anyway. And the cowboy nodded, not to agree, but to acknowledge he was listening, still, as he had always listened. But now his silence was not solitary. It was layered, inhabited, like a house that remembers its guests long after their footsteps have gone. And so he sat, in the same spot, with the same view, with the same wind brushing his sleeves. But now, when he turned his ear to the breeze, he didn't just hear the land. He heard the echo of 6 quiet women who had once come in from the rain and left behind a silence that would never quite be alone again.